Knight f3, f5, c4, Knight f6, b3, d6, d4, g6, bishop b2, bishop g7, g3, knight e4, bishop g2, knight d7, knight bd2, knight df6, castle kingside, castle kingside, d5, e5, d takes e6, bishop takes e6, knight takes e4, f takes e4, knight g5, bishop f5, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, queen d5, check, rook f7, bishop takes g7, c6, queen d4, knight takes f2, bishop h6, knight g4, bishop f4, queen b6, rook a d1, rook e7, bishop f3, knight e3, bishop takes e3, rook takes e3, queen takes b6, a takes b6, rook takes d6, rook e7, rook d2, king g7, g4, bishop e6, king g2, g5, a4, h6, king g3, rook a5, rook c1, rook e5, rook c3, king f6, rook cd3, king g7, h3, b5, c takes b5, c takes b5, a5, b4, rook d4, bishop takes b3, rook takes b4, bishop f7, rook a4, rook b5, rook d6, bishop b3, rook a3, bishop c4, king f2, rook e5, rook b6, bishop a6, rook a2, rook c5, rook d2, rook takes a5, rook d6, rook a2, rook g6, check, king f8, rook bf6, check, king e8, rook d6, King f8. Rook d8 check. King f7. Rook takes h6. King g7. Rook h5. Bishop takes e2. Rook takes g5 check. King h7. Rook h5 check. King g7. Bishop takes e2. Rook a takes e2 check. King g3. Rook to e3 check. King h4. Rook c3. Rook g5 check. King f7. Rook e5. King e6. Rook d5. Rook e3. Rook h5. King d6. Rook h6 check. King c7. Rook c5 check. King d7. King g5. Rook g7 check. King f4. Rook ge7. Rook d5 check. King c7. Rook c5 check. King d7. h4. Rook e1. Rook d5 check. King c7. Rook c5 check. King d7. g5. Rook f1 check. King g4. Rook e4 check. King h5. Rook f4. Rook e6. Rook takes h4 check. King g6. Rook e4. Rook f6. Rook hf4. Rook d5 check. King c7. Rook fd6. Rook f1. Rook d7 check. King c6. Rook 5 d6 check. King c5. Rook d5 check. King c6. King g7. Rook g4. Rook 7 d6 check. King c7. Rook e6. Rook c1. Rook f6. Rook c6. Rook f7 check. King b6. Rook df5. King a6. King h7. Rook h4 check. King g7. Rook g4. Rook 7 f6. Rook takes f6. King takes f6. b5. g6. King a5. Rook g5. Rook F4 check. King E6. Rook F8. G7. Rook G8. King F7. Rook takes G7 check. Rook takes G7. King B4. King E6. King C4. Rook C7 check. King D4. Rook B7. King C4. King E5. B4. King E4. King C3. King E3. B3. Rook C7 check.